We have seen such a change in the supply and demand of Rolex watches over the last few years. It's actually scary how much the landscape has changed, and how the system of restricting supply has now increased demand in such a short period of time. I, like you, enjoy keeping up with the news in the industry. I enjoy seeing how other watch journalists view watches and how they view the industry at large. But the one watch that is so often pushed, promoted, and put on a pedestal is the Daytona, now especially the new generation of ceramic pieces. We hear of people being put on waiting lists for up to 10 years before receiving the watch from an authorized dealer. 10 years! How is that even possible? I made a video a few months ago about Rolex and the tulip trade. It was a bit of fun to create some kind of analogy that linked the skyrocketing demand over Rolex sports pieces. I will link it in the corner of the screen now. Of course, we cannot liken Rolex to tulips, but if you have followed my channel for a while, you know that my approach isn't always by the books. Demand has gone ballistic for sports pieces, and more than any other watch, the Daytona is in the crosshairs for many. It is literally the elusive unicorn that is being hunted. But the Daytona is just a steel sports watch, with an automatic chronograph caliber and a ceramic bezel. Many members of the community, even Rolex collectors, don't see the reasoning why it has been elevated to such heights. And when you consider that the Daytona's entire existence is because of hype, things become more grounded. If we think about the Explorer line, the GMT line, and the Submariner, all of these watches, the creme de la creme of Rolex sports, have all had some form of history and provenance. They were pioneers, land, air, and sea. Their evolution can be seen in the modern pieces today. So most consider the Daytona to be a watch that is extremely overrated because it has none of these attributes to its name. But actually, the Daytona is more important to our fascination in steel sports watches than we might think. What was the climate like for steel Rolex watches in the late 60s, early 70s? They weren't viewed as anything more than good watches to be used. They were by no means cheap, but they also never had an aura around them. People bought them and used them. Of the many lines of watches that Rolex produced at the time, the Daytona was one of the watches that didn't sell. The watch was neglected, and we've heard stories about the watches being dropped on the floor and kicked around the showrooms by staff. Their lack of popularity might have been because there were such excellent alternatives out there. The Speedmaster, the Space Watch, the Carrera, the Racing Watch. Just those two alone were a good enough starting point, and a better, more established group of watches to choose over the Rolex Le Mans. I mean Cosmograph. I mean Daytona. And we all know what happened when Joanne Woodward bought Paul Newman his Daytona, and he turned the watches into this aspiration that were in demand even as far back as the 80s. Now they are some of the rarest watches in the world, and the Daytona name has reached unbelievable heights. It almost plays beat for beat like a Cinderella story, a watch that is neglected like the weak, unappreciated Cinderella that has to be rescued by Prince Charming and is turned into this transcendent object thanks to dumb luck and circumstance. But what has been studied and emphasized by some of the greater academics in the watch collecting community is that the Paul Newman Daytona did a lot more than become a popular and in-demand watch. It did something more than that. It brought attention to the collecting of steel sports watches, especially in the Rolex family. This watch being worn on the wrist of a celebrity helped push the want for the rest of the community to begin collecting. And what is surprising is that there were other figures like Brando and McQueen who wore Rolexes during this time, but never received the same public attention that Newman did. Marlon Brando's 1675 GMT especially is a fascinating watch, and a very unique watch in the sphere of GMTs. I'll be making a video about it and Apocalypse Now in the near future. But you'd half expect the trend to start of having 1675s without bezels, but it never happened. It goes to show that the attention was focused solely towards the Daytona. Not only who wore it, but the watch itself gained the recognition. A few decades later, up until now, steel sports watches have been pushed out more and more. And now from a handful of brands, they are the hottest watches on the market. But the watch that really started this drive in the late 70s and 80s was the Daytona. Of course, there are other collection circles, and many have spent their lives following certain watches, like Speedmasters and their many references. But for the majority, this trend seemed to have been propelled by the Newman, especially after its auction a few years ago. It's a surprising piece of information that isn't emphasized enough, and after knowing this, the watch does deserve to be looked at again. It is a watch that is very much overhyped, but hype not only made it popular, but made steel Rolex watches collectible and sought after in the first place. And this watch, the newest reference, is related to the reference that began the trend. These new pieces also signify the future direction for the brand. So as someone who has never thought too much about the Daytona, since it is just a steel watch with an automatic chronograph caliber and a ceramic bezel, the information about the impact that the Daytona has created in the watch collecting sphere has made me change my mind a bit. As much as I detest how they are being treated as a means to make money, how they have been elevated to unrealistic levels, I have now learned something that does in fact give the watch an X factor, and it's one hell of a talking point. The Daytona then is an important watch, far more important than most of us realize. And when we look at the broader picture and see just how many millions of people have joined the trend of buying modern and vintage sports pieces, it is staggering to consider how pivotal the ugly duckling of the Rolex family became. A watch that very much perpetuated the ever-growing demand for sports watches, and as much as we love it or hate it, a watch that played a key role towards our enthusiasm for steel and the curious effect it has on all of us.